Good morning, Commissioner Hobble.
Good morning, Janelle.
Thank you. We hear you. Good morning, Commissioner Bookland.
Good morning, Janelle. Can you hear me?
I can.
Good.
Good morning, Marty.
Morning,
Thank you. We hear you. Thank you. Good morning, Commissioner Eskridge. Good morning, Commissioner Eskridge.
Good morning, Janelle.
Thank you.
Oh, it's a little after 8 or 8:01. So I'll call the meeting to order. I believe we have a quorum. And there's a couple people absent. Let's see. Welcome to all of our guests. Janelle, would you like to go through the virtual meeting guidance, please?
Certainly. Good morning, Commissioners, members of the public, and staff. To help us have a smooth meeting, I'm going to review just a few decorum rules for all. Number 1, please ensure your mic is muted unless you are speaking. Number 2, please state your name before speaking. Number 3, in general, please have your cameras on if possible if you are speaking. You may turn your cameras off if you experience technological challenges. And 4, as a reminder, the public chat has been disabled, but you can still send messages to the host if need be, and the meeting is being recorded and streamed live on YouTube. Let's have a great meeting, everyone, and happy Thanksgiving.
Okay, thank you, Janelle. Happy Thanksgiving to you. Michael, do you have any announcements?
President Hubble, no announcements today.
Okay,
I'll cover during CED update a few things.
okay, good, thank you. Any appearances by the public? Anybody from the public wish to speak? Okay, I don't see any hands or anybody indication of that. So we'll move on to cash statement, the consent calendar with the minutes of the last meeting, which was November 11th. Cash statement operating fund and review and approval. I think there's one sanitary sewer extension, Cronky Drive area. Any questions before we get a motion? Okay, I don't see any hands being raised or questions. So we'll get a motion to approve the consent calendar.
Wilson, I'll make a motion to approve the items on the consent calendar.
Okay, motion by Commissioner Wilson, second by
I'll second. Commissioner Meyer.
second by Commissioner Meyer. Okay, so we have a motion by Commissioner Wilson, second by Commissioner Meyer to approve the consent calendar. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
And any opposed? None, motion carries. Okay. We'll move on to item 4, which is requests approval to withdraw contested case in Department of Natural Resources with the DNR for the UV disinfection season.
Thank you,
Michael?
President Hubble. I'll take the lead on this. What I'd like to do is provide a brief overview to the commission, just to remind you where we've been, and for the public who may not have been following our work with the DNR on this. Our reissued WPDES permit, Wisconsin Pollution Discharge Elimination permit, was approved in April 2020. And it includes an extended disinfection season of 3 months. And that new season will go into effect in the spring of 2023, in March. After 4 years of negotiation, this provision was added to our permit pretty much at the last minute, because of claims that our wastewater discharge quality was unsafe for human contact. Those claims were never substantiated with reliable data, and staff did not have a chance to have what I'd call extended discussions with the DNR on understanding that data and seeing if there was another solution. Operationally, meeting the extended disinfection period is feasible with a relatively low life cycle cost increase. However, routine maintenance at the plant that normally occurs outside the disinfection window would allow us to safely do work and minimize any risk to our discharge permit due to potential process upsets. Clearly, the shorter off-season restricts when we can perform that work. We went to the commission and last year, and the commission authorized staff to file for a contested case to challenge the new permit requirement based on no foundation of fact. The commission also directed staff to proceed cautiously and find a way to settle the matter to avoid the expense and risk of proceeding with a contested case hearing. We approached the DNR in the fall of last year with a proposal to use interest-based problem solving, which focuses more on interests versus positions, to see if there was just a better way to find common ground with the DNR, because there were strong positions by the DNR and even us, even the district. We had strong opinions ourselves. It was clear going into these interest-based problem-solving sessions that the DNR was not going to change the disinfection period without a strong challenge. The alternative to finding common ground through this process would be to gear up to make our case to the DNR with paid experts, likely some paid studies, and of course legal costs. These costs could escalate and the dispute could drag out possibly for years. The $50,000 for legal that I had in the commission agenda report I would call that a soft estimate of what it would initially cost to file and build our case. However, it could be much more than that, but that would be highly speculative at this point. Our focus with the interest-based discussions with the DNR was more about conversations we had with key department staff to nurture future working relationships and to make sure we understood each other better. Their rationale for the extended season was this: they viewed the district as a leader. They respected us greatly, and they were really pushing us to raise the bar on behalf of the industry, particularly on things that appear to be easy for the district to do. They thought the extended disinfection season period was a no-brainer, and we would enthusiastically support it because of our strong environmental ethic. They were actually shocked when we filed a contested case. We surprised them with that. Their motivation in our discussions were a couple things, but mostly and primarily is climate change and water being open longer for public recreation. And that is why we have disinfection. It's human contact with water. The DNR will likely be moving toward increasing disinfection periods more broadly in the future, but they needed to start somewhere and saw the public comment as a result of our permit that it was challenging that disinfection period as a way to initiate change for the state of Wisconsin. This is my interpretation. The DNR did not say this at all, but I believe they understood adding the new regulation without facts may have been premature, but they were doing it for what they felt was the right reason long term. The letter of agreement before you today essentially says if the district can provide hard data to the contrary, the DNR will consider it. The letter also includes what I call a forgiveness clause, but it's not maybe as strongly worded as we all would like, because while the DNR would never concede their enforcement authority, they would take into consideration our operational challenges if we have a strong violation during routine scheduled maintenance of our operations. And I believe this is significant. And Paul can't be able to articulate this way better than I can. But because we have already indicated to the DNR that we will have times of the year where we are doing clarifier cleaning, and we may have planned temporary process upsets, we're putting the DNR on notice that we could potentially have some brief challenges. And this is very similar to what we've done with our air permit. I've reported to you periods of time where we've briefly violated our air regulations because we've had to take the system offline to maintain our air filtering system. This, in some ways, it is similar to that. From a legal standpoint, and Paul Kent was very clear about this, that the DNR would have a more difficult time enforcing such a temporary disruption since we already gave them this early warning with good justification. So really to wrap this all up for you, probably a broad question is it in the public interest to fight something in principle versus holding back for something that really matters to our owners' communities? So in other words, does this really matter to our owner communities? Because we can't cash in our cars on every issue, and we have to be selective on where we challenge the DNR. The chloride variance was worth the challenge because it saved our owners $500 million. But there are, on the other side, risks to proceeding with a contested case. We could lose the contested case hearing. The study results may not support our assumptions. Climate change may eventually push us to extend our season anyway because of public expectation. Our relationship with the DNR would be strained, bleeding into other more important issues. So given all of these risks and very few rewards for the district, I feel very strongly that this letter really sets us for a positive future. And I believe when we met, when staff met with the commission last year, I sensed that the commission may have felt similarly. But the relationship building and processes we use to work through these disagreements will serve the district and the DNR in a positive manner moving forward. And I believe this letter sets a good tone and a strong foundation by which to build from. And just as a side note, before I turn it over to Attorney Kent and Marty for additional comments to fill in any gaps that I may have missed. They really like the interspace problem solving process, and they are using it for other disagreements they're having with other utilities. So with that, I will stop talking and turn it over to Paul Kent.
Okay, good morning. I don't have a lot to add, just to reinforce a couple of points that Michael made. One is, I think the fine point on the issue is the question of to what extent does our discharge or the bacteria level in our discharge affect incidental contact. And the question isn't about disinfection during the time that people would have primary contact with the water, like swimming or so-called full immersion, but times when people are doing things like kayaking or fishing. And could you fall into the water during those seasons and be impacted? And the results on that are really, they're really, the standards weren't based on that kind of incidental contact. But you'll notice the letter does allow us to look at studies. We're aware of an ongoing study right now being done by others. One is in Iowa, which is looking at this issue, so that if there is additional information that comes to bear, or based upon our own continued monitoring, we have a case to make. We do have kind of an opportunity to present that to the district, and they said that they would consider that. And then just to comment briefly on the enforcement, it's, the department is not in a position to prospectively waive enforcement or give up enforcement discretion, but the fact that they're acknowledging that, under these circumstances, and the letter talks about kind of our process of notification and review and so forth, that they would, take that into account. Frankly, is about as far as the department will go on this, but I think as a practical matter, as Michael said, provides us with some comfort that a routine problem is not going to put us in an enforcement context. So those are really the only points I wanted to make, and I'd be glad to answer any questions after Marty has a chance to make a few notes.
I have nothing else to add. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Michael.
Okay, thank you, Michael, Paul, Marty. Do we have any questions or comments by any of the commission members? Sarah.
Thanks, Tom. Just a quick question about operations.
So Michael, I see we're estimating more just for using equipment more vigorously or more during the longer period. I know we talked a bit about staff safety, and so I just wonder if you could say a bit more about operational impacts of this change and how those will be mitigated and how we're going to prioritize the time that staff will need to keep the clarifiers clean and operational.
We'll have enough time with the March 2023 start to adapt our operations slightly to conform with the narrow window. And so we feel we can work around it safely. We'll never put our workforce in an unsafe condition. And the unsafe condition is we go into these clarifiers, we drain them down, and we do not want to be in freezing ice conditions because of slip falls and situations, because we're pressure washing all the material off the sides. And so we'll work on some new protocols of when conditions are satisfactory and safe to do that work, and handle it that way. And if we can't, then we will do that work during a time when it is safe, and it may cause some temporary disruptions to effluent quality.
Thank you.
Okay, anyone else?
One quick question from me, and then I might have a comment too. Question-wise, Michael and everybody, the $750,000 estimate on increased operating expenses for running through a longer season, is that a combination of the equipment reaches the end of its useful life sooner, so we have to replace it sooner? And I'm thinking it has to also include like the electricity costs, because these are relatively intensive electricity use for the UV bulbs. Is it a combination of those two things kind of worked out over the 25 years?
It is. It's right. It's the mileage and the operation.
Great. Just clarifying that. Yeah, that helps. Thank you. Just my quick comment would be, I mean, thank you for all the good work from staff and Paul. And I like this kind of process that has the best chances of yielding a good result. It seems like this time it was both a good process and a good result. And seems like it was, it had the intended or unintended, I don't know, effect of sort of strengthening our relationship with the department, which is an important thing. And so I see that and all the other aspects of it as a net positive. So I think we're in a good place here. Appreciate the work on it.
Okay, thanks, Ezra. Anyone else? Tom?
Yeah, I again appreciate Paul and all for what you did in this, and doing it probably about as good as we could do with the department. Just another example that like MMSD, all of our local governments are dealing with mandates that come down from the top without thinking about what the cost might be in the long run for their local community. But at the same time, satisfies a request from basically a local recreational community that and shows that we're willing to do what we can to do as well as we can for those. So this is a resolution that makes a lot of sense, and I'd certainly move that we accept the resolution as presented here to withdraw that contested case based on the letter, which is pretty well written, frankly, in terms of how we can resolve this and maybe take some more steps in the future with the DNR. So I'd make the motion to approve that.
Okay, motion by Commissioner Wilson to approve the resolution to withdraw from the contested case with the DNR. Do we have a second?
I'll second that, Commissioner
Okay,
Clark.
second by Commissioner Clark. Anyone else have any comments? None? Okay, I talked to Michael a little bit yesterday about this, and Tom, I have to agree with you, kind of that idea of mandate, and it's unfortunate the DNR chose to put this in at the last minute instead of having the staff was in discussion with them for a couple of years on the permit renewal. And instead of having taken that opportunity to say, hey, what do you think about this? Because obviously it has challenges for us in our operations. And so I got kind of one more larger policy issue, Michael or Paul. If the DNR is moving that way, have you guys discussed this with any other treatment plants within our region or the state to say, hey, you better be heads up on this?
Well, let me jump in on this one, and then Michael, feel free to add your insights on this. I think one of the things that was very interesting from my perspective was that the department earlier this year actually introduced a guidance document that would promote some of these same concepts on a statewide basis. And based upon the comments that were received, including comments from other wastewater facilities and organizations, that guidance was withdrawn, not amended, withdrawn, which is a little unusual from the department standpoint. So I think I think the department is on notice that there are other people that are concerned about this. And I think the wastewater community as a whole understands that this is something we're going to need to continue to monitor as well. But I think, as Michael said, this is probably an issue that's going to be coming back. And I think that's one of the reasons why it'll be good for us to also be monitoring these other studies like the Iowa study to see, if we can get some better data on this so that we're in a better position to know one way or the other going forward.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Michael, you have anything to add? No. Ezra, you have a comment?
Yeah, just that reminded me of one thought that occurred to me as I read over the agenda report on this. Obviously we'd want to be mindful of cost, but I wonder if doing some of the study that I think is alluded to somewhere, I remember reading it in here. I don't know if it's must not be in the letter. It must be in our material in the agenda report. But the idea of studying fecal coliform or E. coli bacteria in the creek over the entire year, and really understanding how that works and our role in contributing to those levels. If that kind of study is something that feels like it's affordable for us to do and really get a better handle on this, the underlying sort of issue behind what we're talking about here, I think that might be really valuable for us, and it could inform that whole statewide policy discussion that it seems DNR is wanting to edge into. So just a thought that occurred to me as I thought about this whole thing.
Yeah, thanks, Ezra. Anybody have any response to that? I guess it's a situation of the E. coli that's in the stream, how much of it is identifiable to MMSD? And I guess you could say, it's kind of a before and after, but I don't know how you equalize all the other variables that are out there, right? Septic systems or waste lots, stuff like that. But I don't know if anybody has
there's kind of two elements to this. One is kind of exactly what's there and where is it coming from. And those are the kinds of studies that, and others can correct me here, but are relatively not that expensive. I think the real underlying question is, okay, so if there is E. coli in the water in December, what impact does that have on public health? So for the few people that are kayaking, in November, if they have incidental contact with water with some elevated level, is that a public health concern? That kind of study that looks at cause and effect with public health is a much more expensive process. And I think as a practical matter is something that's probably better for us to be monitoring to see what's going on elsewhere. But certainly getting some additional information on basic numbers is something that, the district could at some point choose to look at.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? We had a motion by Commissioner Wilson. Was it Ken that seconded it? Do you remember? Yep. So any other commission members? Okay. We'll take a vote on the motion. All those in favor of withdrawing the contested case by approval of the resolution, say aye.
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 And any opposed, say nay. Okay, motion carries. You can let the DNR know. That will move us to 4B, which is a study session for the plan for evaluating and improving the district service charge methodology. And I suppose Bill's going to lead that.
It's
Or
actually, yeah, me, Commissioner. Yep,
Okay.
Ben Urad here. Hello, everyone. Let me share my screen. All right. Let's see. Can folks see my PowerPoint slides? Okay.
Yes, we can, Ben. You
Okay.
look good.
Thank you. Well, hello, everyone. I'm Ben Urad. I'm the Capital Investment Policy Advisor for the district. As commissioners know, I was here last month presenting on the 2022 service charge and septage rates. And at the time indicated that I'd be back in November to talk through kind of some of the next steps that we are thinking about relative to our service charges, relative to some of the feedback that we've gotten, and thinking about how do we want to move forward, really to address some of the feedback that we've heard from owner communities over the years about our service charges. So that's, I guess, in a nutshell, what I'm here to talk about today. In terms of the agenda, so I've got 3 areas that I want to focus on. Starting first with an inventory of service charge improvement opportunities. So this is kind of our running list of, what have we heard? What are the considerations that we're thinking about as we go through this effort to kind of look at our service charges, look at our, rate structure, billing process, et cetera. Second is a project plan. So as we move forward in this effort, what are we planning to do and when are we planning to do it, essentially? And then third, we've got actually a proposal that we want to get some initial feedback on relative to our billing process of a change that we think we could make for 2023 that would address the issue that I talked about last month, which was this variability issue in terms of what we project in service charges versus what we actually end up billing at the end of the day. So that's the agenda for today. And I think generally what I'm hoping for from the commission is just to get a sense of, are there things that we're missing? Are there questions that you have as we move forward here? Any feedback that you have would be appreciated. Any questions before I jump in? All right, so again, I'll start with kind of our inventory of service charge improvement opportunities. So again, these are the things that we've heard about, that we're tracking on and plan to be reviewing as we move forward in this effort to review our service charge process as it exists today. So I won't go through these one by one unless there are questions, in which case I'm happy to dive in, but just, I guess, at a high level, the 3 categories here. One is, again, this variability issue between our projection of service charges and what we actually end up, billing and collecting. Second is a host of rate structure considerations. And by rate structure, I mean, kind of what are the service charge rate parameters that we have? What are the implications of that structure, if you will? What are the incentives, disincentives, et cetera? And then there are some, additional considerations that are, I think, related to our service charges. There's a connection there, but might be more like separate projects, such as, I&I obviously is a project that we're already working on, industrial sources of wastewater, et cetera. So that's kind of our list at a high level. I'll pause here in case there are any questions or comments. But again, we just wanted to make sure that folks were aware, what are the issues that we're tracking on as we start, going through this process. Right. So next, I'm going to just talk through our project plan. Again, this is, what are we planning to do and when are we planning to do it, to get any feedback from you all on this. So first is kind of a first phase here is somewhat of maybe a discovery period. You can think about it that way. It's really to say, here are the issues that we're tracking on, just as I mentioned in the last slide. Are there things that we're missing? Do we fully understand from our owner communities what their pinch points are today relative to our service charges and our rates and our billing process? So you can see the intention is, really as we go through the first quarter of the next year, to have those owner community discussions. Again, to really nail that down, make sure that we fully understand their concerns. And then I would plan to come back kind of in this March timeframe and say, here's what we heard, right? Did we hear any surprises? Was there anything, unexpected, or did this more or less confirm what we thought? But to bring that back to you all in the commission so that you understand as we kind of go into the next steps of really looking at potential changes, what are the problems, if you will, that we're solving for, so that everyone's clear on that before we start, making any changes. The next kind of path here is, again, and I'll talk about this in the next section, but we think that there's a change that we can make that would address this variability issue. And assuming that we don't get any negative feedback at this point, we think it's a good idea, but we need to hear from either you all in the commission or owner communities. Are there things that we're missing? But we think it's one of those more immediate changes that we could make for 2023 billing. And so we would seek to, again, following those owner community discussions, seek to really kind of finalize our decision of whether we go forward with that kind of mid-year, June here, so that there's plenty of time for us at the district to plan for that administratively, plenty of time for our owner communities to hopefully, understand what we're planning to do there. So that's kind of a more immediate change that we're looking at. Again, that's dependent still on, any additional feedback that we get. So I do want to emphasize that. And then the third phase here is kind of this broader list of rate structure considerations. And you can see it's a wider arrow. And what that I guess means is that there's more there, right? So if we go back to that list from the last slide deck, there are a whole host of considerations relative to our rate structure that I think we need to the way I think about it is, our rate structure has essentially been the same since the mid-1990s. And I think there's a benefit that we have from the district's perspective to kick the tires every so often and just ensure that it still continues to meet kind of our business needs and our owner communities needs as well. So that's, I guess, kind of broadly what we intend to do there. In terms of kind of the specific steps that we see that process entailing, we would look at likely hiring a consultant who, works with multiple, wastewater utilities, who's kind of been through this before, understands, what are some of the current best practices, and, use that expertise to develop a set of, feasible options in terms of potential changes, bring those back to the commission so that you all would have a chance to kind of understand what is it that we are potentially looking at. Do you have any initial feedback? Then bring that to our owner communities again for feedback. And then, assuming all goes well, then finalize. And that's, you can see here that arrow continues, and that is intended to show that it's something that we would plan to start in 2022, but depending on the ultimate scope that we would have, depending on any questions, concerns that we would need to work through, that could continue, into 2023 and beyond, just kind of depending on that scope, which is, a little bit to be determined at this point in time. So that's what I wanted to share on the plan. Again, kind of the way that we want to approach this, and I hope it's demonstrated here, is to really have this be a collaborative process between the district and you all on the commission, but then also importantly, our owner communities. And so we tried to build in multiple, as you can see here, multiple touch points with our owner communities, multiple touch points with you all on the commission, so that we're not doing this in isolation, so that no one's, surprised. That's kind of not our intent here. But with that, I'll just pause to see if there's any feedback on this plan. Does this make sense? Does it feel like there are enough of those touch points here? Is there anything that we're missing? I'll pause.
Okay, Ben, I don't see any hands raised.
Yep.
Oh, Ken Clark just came on.
So Ben, if I understand this correctly, flattening out or having a consistent, assisting our member communities with a consistent budget is one of the benefits to this, correct?
So that's, I that specific benefit is, from my perspective, kind of attached to the proposal that's in the next section of the presentation, kind of this reduced variability, kind of the green phase on this project plan, if you will. It kind of, and I'll go into it in a moment, but it removes that variability, that lack of knowing, once the budget's done, we today say, okay, here's what you can expect for your next year's service charges. But that's an estimate, right? That's a projection. And it's by its nature going to be different than what we actually end up billing, right? And so that piece of the proposal would basically say, here's what your service charges are, and then that is what their service charges actually end up being as we go throughout the year. So there are kind of multiple pieces to this. I think that's, in terms of that broader list of what do we see as kind of the areas for improvement, right? Opportunities for improvement, if you will. I think that's a major one, and one that we think we can move forward on, I think more quickly for 2023, again, barring, feedback that we're, I guess today, not necessarily expecting, but, may get in terms of, okay, we haven't thought about this or that. And then there's kind of that broader list of, what is our rate structure today? What should it be? And that's kind of the longer time frame, if you will, kind of the starting in 2022, but extending out, past that.
Okay. And I'll let you continue. I apologize.
No worries. Yeah, it's appreciate the question, and it's maybe a good segue if there aren't any additional questions on this piece of it.
Ben, I have one. So do you have any idea what a consultant study would cost on this? You've probably looked at other districts that have done something like this, or not?
Yeah. So our intention is to do a request for information from consultants that are out there to give us a sense of kind of who's out there before we jump into that. I can say, based on prior experience, not in the wastewater industry, but in other industries hiring rate consultants, which was kind of in my last role, something that I did a number of times. I think, well, I don't know. I would say very low six figures, probably for some duration of time. And I think that's consistent with consultants that we hire for other purposes as well. But I think we are planning to be very thoughtful about our procurement process so that we understand what is the very specific scope that we have here. How do we ensure that we tackle this in an efficient way that doesn't lead to scope creep and doesn't lead to expenses beyond what we need to be spending to accomplish what we want to accomplish. So I think to be determined as we go through our procurement process, but again, I think we are trying to be as thoughtful and as focused as possible to ensure that we are buying exactly what we need and nothing more.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else have any questions? Okay, Ben, I think you can move on.
Okay. All right. So Commissioner Clark set me up well here for this next section, which is kind of really a proposal for change to our current service charge billing process that would utilize historic flow and loading data to address that variability issue. And again, when I talk about variability, I'm talking about the difference between what we project in service charges, whether that's to our owner communities in terms of what they should expect to be billed, or our own variability in terms of from a budgeting perspective in terms of what we think we're going to get in service charge revenue versus what we actually end up getting. To start, I'm just going to kind of back up a little bit and at a high level in terms of, what is our goal of service charges, right? I think, and this is, I think reflected in commission policy, our goal for service charges is to fairly allocate what are largely fixed costs across our 26, paying owner communities, right? We have a revenue need and we have a need to fairly allocate that cost again. And I think there's been kind of a belief over time that's been formed that says, well, in order to do that, we need to be kind of billing throughout the year based on flow and loading measurements that we take throughout the year, right? So I think folks are aware every quarter we've got staff who are out in the field taking measurements. Our labs are testing those. We're working on our calculating the bills. It's a little bit of a rush to kind of get that done every quarter, and that I think belief has led. That doing that process on a quarter by quarter basis is that source of variance, right? It is the source of difference between what we think we're going to be billing at the end of the budget process versus what we actually end up billing. And there are approaches that other wastewater utilities take that don't introduce that source of variability. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Question?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I hope this is the right time for this, but I think as you're laying the groundwork for this new proposal, that this would be the right spot. Could you maybe spend a minute exploring that contention or that sort of premise, 3 words there, which is largely fixed cost?
Yeah.
We need to know, I think, to be able to make the kind of decision you're going to ask us to at least weigh in on today, not make a final decision, but we need to know how the fixed and variable nature of our operation ties back to the flows and loads that come in from the customers and the owner communities. So if you could explore that a minute now, if you think that's an appropriate time for it, I know I'd benefit from it greatly.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to, and I appreciate you raising the question because I think that is a really key concept that we've talked a lot about internally too, because it's pretty fundamental to understanding what we ought to be doing from a service charge perspective. So I guess what I can say is that as we talk internally and think about, what does our cost structure look like today? What do we do and what changes the cost of what we do? What I've learned, and I've only been here, 7-8 months or so now, but what I've learned is that fundamentally we are, operating the treatment plant and the conveyance system to bring waste to us. And, to look at it maybe somewhat simplistically, any additional gallon of flow by itself does not fundamentally change our costs, right? There's going to be kind of a base fixed cost, and this is really what I'm referring to operate our treatment plant, and we design it to be able to take flows that are projected to give us time to have population growth, what have you. But when we look at variance in flows and our costs, I have not been able to find a really clear view to say, well, again, for any additional gallon of flow, our costs increase by X amount, right? Now, certainly there are types of waste that we can receive that are more challenging than others, and that can lead to higher chemical, staff, maybe even energy costs in some cases, but generally our costs are fairly, I would say, fixed in nature. And I think another point that I think about as well is, the variability that exists, right? Because our costs are going to just vary over time, day to day, month to month, in terms of our resource use, right? I think that's the case for any organization. That sort of variability is already captured in our budgeting process today, right? We're not experiencing really, I would say, new variability that exceeds or goes beyond what we've experienced historically. And that historic experience is built into our budgeting process because we're essentially building off of historic costs, if that makes sense. So I think what I've come to understand is that kind of fundamentally, because our costs are generally related to kind of operating this wastewater treatment plant and this conveyance system to get there, it's largely fixed in nature, and then it's further fixed through our budgeting process. I've got, looks like Bill, you've got something that you want to add.
I want to agree, and I also want to add one point that I think can help people understand why our costs are fixed. This is something a lot of people who are not familiar with wastewater don't understand. The commission does. We are designed to handle peak flows. So people who are used to thinking about drinking water or electrical utilities, which are designed basically to handle average demands, might not be able to think in the same way. We have to spend enough money and build enough infrastructure to handle the largest flow that we realistically expect. And having spent that much money, we then spend most of the time coping with average flow. We've already designed for a very high amount of flow. And the sort of day-to-day variation around average doesn't affect the fact that we've already spent that large amount. We design for peak, that's all.
I'll jump on to what Bill is saying as well. And during high flow periods, we do see higher energy costs and higher use of chemicals. But those are, relatively speaking, small and can be easily absorbed, are easily absorbed in our budget. And if it was prolonged for several years, that would be a different story. But through several months, we can see that, and that's, if it's a worst case scenario, that's why we have a budget reserve to handle. So I wanted to say that as well.
Thanks, Michael.
Ken, you have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to comment. So Michael, that would take care of the scenario of we're in a year where we bill out, or we're experiencing 35 million gallons a day, and we're invoicing on that next year. And then we get to next year and we're actually experiencing 45 million gallons a day. So what you're saying is the power and the chemical, those are relatively small variable costs associated with an extra 5 to 10 million gallons a day of treated effluent. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
So Ben or Michael or somebody, can you give us an idea of, like a standard, let's take a wet year. Okay. So that was a couple of years ago, we had a wet year. What percent of our costs, maybe you don't know this, but you could look into it, were probably the fixed costs, and what percent of that were variable costs? Is it like, are we looking at 1 or 2% variable or higher, or you have any idea?
I'm not sure of the specific number. I certainly understand the question and why you're asking. I'm not. Yeah, I'd have to think about that, and if we'd be able to kind of look at it in that way. I mean, to Michael's point, there are those energy and chemical costs that are kind of probably the primary variable costs. But yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know if Michael or Bill, you have anything more offhand to add on that. But think more about that, certainly.
We can
I'll
return
add
with
to-
an, go ahead, Bill.
I was going to say, yes, we'll return with an answer, but we can also sort of ballpark it by thinking about how our budget is constructed. Huge proportion of our budget is capital and debt service costs, which are getting at, again, fixed assets. Another very large chunk is staff costs. We don't hire a new person when it rains. So that is, in the sense we're using it here, fixed. And then the sort of things that go along with equipment and so on don't change. So the only things that change in response to a rain event are, as Michael's been saying, the power to handle that event in the moment, possible additional chemicals.
Yeah, that's what I think it's probably rather small percent of the overall budget, because I think we had a time when we were asked to increase chemical costs recently, and I don't think that was for, I think it was for something else, but I've never known a time when we've been asked to increase our energy use budget. So we probably budget for that on the basis of more a worst case scenario too than not, maybe. Okay, why do you move on, Ben? Unless anybody else has any questions. Okay.
Sounds good. Yeah, no, good. Really good question. So to get into the potential change, right? So what am I exactly proposing here? So the change would be to use historic flow and loading data. So data that we've collected, right? But from a prior year, both to set rates and then also to calculate our service charges in advance. So let me share kind of maybe a graphical representation of what that would look like. And then I'll kind of pause for questions. So under our current practice, so I've got this image here where year one, and to maybe use the example of what we've just gone through, right? So we just set rates last month, right, for 2022. So we set the rates for the next year. We set rates for 2022 based on a projection of flows and loadings, right? So we try and get a sense of, well, what do we think the next year is going to look like, given some historic data, but then also given, how do we think weather is going to change, which is a challenging question to answer. How do we think industrial growth is going to change? What are we going to get to the plant, right? That's really the fundamental question. And it's a guess. It's an educated guess, and I think we do a good job at it, but fundamentally it's a guess. It's an assumption that we make about what the future is going to look like. And then as we go, so we set the rates for the next year. And then as we go into that next year, so again, to use this example, as we go into 2022, we're then calculating bills based on the current year flow and load data, right? So as I already mentioned, you already know, we've got staff in the field every quarter. We're taking those measurements of flow and loading data. And then we invoice bills kind of based on that calculation that we do every quarter, right? So under this proposal, what would most fundamentally change is this circled part of the process, which is the bill calculation step. And really, rather than using that current year flow and loading data as we go throughout the year, we would instead kind of take it back in terms of when we calculate that and use historic flow and loading data to calculate bills in advance. So essentially what it would look like is we would finish our budgeting process and we would know at that point in time what the service charge bills are going to be for each of the 26 owner communities that are billed owner communities today. And then as we go into that next year, we would essentially just take that number, split it up into 4 pieces, and bill on the same kind of time frame, same cadence as we do today on that under that quarterly time frame. So it's using our actual measured flow and loading data, but just from a most recent completed year or two, right? So again, if we use this year as an example, maybe we would have used 2020 or 2020 and 2019 flow and loading data to basically allocate that revenue requirement. That's essentially what we'd be doing. We would use that same time period not only for bill calculation purposes, but then also for setting the rates themselves. So this calculation hopefully looks familiar. This is what I've shared last month and has been shared with you in the past in terms of how we calculate our service charge rates today. So we are essentially taking the revenue requirement as authorized in the budget and dividing it today by our estimate of loads and flows to be treated district-wide, right? So again, we're trying to predict what the future looks like. And again, instead of using that estimate, right, we would no longer be using an estimated value. We would instead be using actual historic loads and flows, again, from a most recent year or 2 years to calculate the rates. And then again, use those rates to calculate bills in advance. And then we would go throughout the year, every quarter's bill would look the same. And, we would know in advance exactly what our revenues are going to be for the next year. Our owner communities would know in advance exactly what their service charge bills are going to be for the next year. And that's really kind of the key benefit, the key issue that we are trying to solve with this proposal. I do want to mention just briefly, and then I will pause for any questions. We did look into, well, what could some potential concerns with this approach be, right? So one could be, well, if you're using historic data, you're not going to be reflecting kind of the most recent set of changes, right? So most recent, maybe there's a huge population growth in one community versus another, or significant industrial growth in one community versus another. But we would ultimately reflect that under this proposal, right? It would ultimately flow into that historic data set that we'd be using for rate setting and service charge bill calculation. It would just be on kind of a lagged basis. And I think from my perspective, all this is obviously pending feedback from you all in our owner communities, the benefit that we would get from kind of having that known kind of guaranteed bill outweighs maybe the slight downside of having that lag. We also reviewed, okay, is this contrary to any district policy, state policy? And I guess the short answer is no. Paul Kent's team took a look at this so he can respond to any specific legal questions, but essentially we were not seeing any challenges from that perspective relative to this proposal either. So I'm going to pause there to see if there are any, I guess, first kind of questions or just general feedback on this. Does this make sense, et cetera?
Okay, Tom, you have a question?
Maybe. The question is, have we run this by our communities to see what they think?
So not yet. That is kind of the immediate next step, that we would be having those discussions over the next few months and basically saying, here's what we're thinking. We think it's a good idea, but what do you think? Is there something that we're not thinking about?
That's good. So, and I'm not sure that I'm necessarily sold on this at all, in fact. So I can think of, I'm going to, from MMSD's perspective, I understand that there's no variance in the rates and or what we receive from our local communities, and maybe it helps with our budgeting a little bit. But at the same time, let's say, I'm trying to think of an example about where these service charges might have got reflected more in the current time period than using past times, like for when DeForest had. I think it was Sanimax went down. I mean, their service charges had to decline for the entire community, right? Because that's what you're doing. You're billing a community based on the whole of their usage, their flow. And so in that situation, when Sanimax goes down, it had a significant effect on what I believe, what our quarterly service charges would have been to DeForest. So, historically, does that catch up? Because now we're looking at, does that catch up the next year? And let's say the next year Sanimax goes back in times 2. And then you're increasing the next year. I mean, there's some variability here. Or let's say Wanakee next year has some road projects that they include fixing some mains, and those mains had been old, and there was significant I&I involved in that. And all of a sudden, they have taken the expense to fix that problem, and now their bill doesn't catch up until the next year. But in the meantime, perhaps they've had some growth and their flow was higher. I mean, Westport, we have a new development of, let's say, 44 homes. And normally we see 10 building permits a year. Well, what if all of a sudden everybody wants to move into Westport and those 44 homes go pop? And let's say they're all big homes with 5 bathrooms and 3 bars. And, I'm not convinced that not billing on actual use is actually going to help our communities and make it fair across the board. So I know Tim Herlitzka is on here, and probably somebody that I'm going to talk to or hear from on this for certain. And I did send the memo on to my sewer utility manager to ask what he thinks about it. We're going to have another discussion on sometime before the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, where we're missing 2 of our important Madison commissioners to figure this out. And I just wanted to make those comments, those concerns, and maybe it's something that can be addressed in the future and go from there. But thanks for working to try and come up with something that does help everybody. And I understand the concern with the variability from the local communities. But when we've got all these growing communities and communities trying to cut costs in different ways, sometimes maybe there's got to be another way to figure out how to reward that. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Ken?
Yeah, Ben, just so I'm clear, this thought process with historical rates, would that, so DeForest would, or Wanakee would get invoiced on an average of their historical rates? It wouldn't be a blend of the entire district.
Right. It would be based on their actual historic flow and loading data that we measured, a year or 2 ago, essentially.
Okay. And so my second question is, Tom hit on it a little bit. What if you have a high BOD contributor in a municipality or in an area? Do they get invoiced based on their usage, or does that get blended with that member community?
So I'm sorry. So if one of the 26 communities has higher BOD effluent than others, would our billings reflect that? Is that the question?
So to Tom's question, somebody like Santa Max, who's a high BOD contributor into the system, will they still be metered separately and billed that way?
Oh, I see. Okay. So, I mean, fundamentally, if I'm understanding your question correctly, that would still continue to be a decision for the local community to make in terms of how they want to set up that billing process, essentially.
Okay.
Okay, Beth, you have your hand up. But before you ask the question, Ezra, you have your hand up. Is that from before, or do you have a question again?
I'm sorry, it's an oversight that I left it on from before, but I actually do have something, maybe if I could go after Beth. Sorry about that.
Just want to make sure. Okay, we'll do Beth and
Okay. I also have some concerns about the variability that both Tom and Ken had mentioned, and how we're going to adapt to that. But also, have you, and you might have already done this, but have you gone back and tested the model going back in history? So going back and saying, okay, looking in previous years, have you tested that to see if it really is going to work?
So I think So the model from my perspective, it's really about, we are still going to reflect each community's actual flow and loads as we measure them today. So that does not change at all. What changes simply, or maybe not so simply, is basically just rather than, for our Q1 2022 bill, say we had made this change already, which we didn't obviously, but for our Q1 2022 bill, rather than using kind of the flow and loadings that we would measure in the weeks before, we would use the flow and loadings that we measured, a year ago, basically for that community. So it would still reflect each community's relative contribution of flows and loads that come into the district. What would change is that we would use that flow and load data from a historic time period. And what that allows us to do then is basically calculate bills in advance so that everyone would know earlier exactly what their bills are going to be. And so there is that lag issue, right? In terms of if there is a change as we go throughout the year, the bills would not vary from quarter to quarter. So that within a given year, that those changes would not be reflected. It would only be reflected, in a year or so then when that historic time period kind of flows into our rate setting and bill calculation process, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a little bit helpful. And what about industrial contributions, and how would you include those in your model?
So it wouldn't change relative to what we do today. So I'm not proposing any changes to our rate structure, any changes to how we at the district, account for industrial users. We would basically keep the same rate structure as is, and just basically use that historic data from a billing perspective. I'm not sure if that quite answers your question, but there wouldn't kind of be a change from the district's perspective in terms of how we consider industrial users as part of that, except again, that if there's significant variation throughout the year, we would only capture that variation in the future when that kind of flows into the historic time period used for rate setting and bill calculation.
Yeah, and my only concern with that would be, if we had an industry who had a lot of variation from month to month or whatever, we might not be capturing that until later.
Sure, understood. And I think that kind of gets back to the conversation we were having earlier in terms of our costs being largely fixed in nature. So while we can see changes that can be significant from a flow loadings perspective, any additional costs that would be incurred by the district would be relatively small, compared to the broader fixed costs that we have. And, generally would be accounted for through kind of our budgeting and fund balance process.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Ezra, and then Grant's on after Ezra. But can I make an observation? The discussion that we've been having, it seems to me that if we were to go in this route, the best option is to just look at the past year instead of trying to take 1, 2, or 3 years or something like that. Just look at the past year, and then they're capturing what they would have captured in the billing year, except it's just delayed a year. So you're not softening it by looking at more than 1 year.
Right.
Okay.
And I think that is kind of the key, balance that you have to make.
Yeah. Okay, Ezra?
Yeah, I have one quick reaction to what you just said, Tom. Everything I was going to say is going to build off of what Ben put in the background here about why do we use our charges, or what are we trying to accomplish? We're trying to fairly allocate the costs across the communities. So I wonder about what you just said, Tom, from the opposite angle. It rains harder on Middleton than it does on the southern and the eastern parts of the district in a given year, and the flows are dramatically higher, and that throws the relative proportion of that section of our customer communities kind of out of whack with where they really are. If you do more of a rolling average with 2 years or 3 years, you kind of smooth that out and keep those extremes from making larger than they really should be sort of impact on the apportionment across communities. I might be right about that, or Ben, Bill, think about that. I guess I don't mean to state it like I'm definitely right, but it seems to me like an important consideration that came up in reaction to what you said, Tom. My point was going to be, though, I mean, again, so apportioning these costs across the communities, we do an extraordinarily good job of that the way we currently work. Maybe too good, which is, I think, why we're here talking about. Maybe it's so good that we're literally pinned to the weather in a given quarter, and we're measuring the exact flows and loads that come in, and that's great on that measure. But it makes it hard for the customer communities because they don't know exactly what the bills are going to be, because they were what they saw in our budget was a guess, and then we bill on reality. How much does it rain? How much does it flow? So, and I think we trade off those two things. If we go the way that you're suggesting, we lose a little bit of that incredible accuracy to reality, but we give a little bit more smoothness and more predictability to the communities. It's a really tough balance. I'm not sure I've got a clear leaning myself today as I think about all of it, but I think if there's one point I could make, it's that I really would want to hear from the customer communities how strong this concern is about the way it's a bit unpredictable for them what they're going to owe next year each quarter. Because if that's not a really, really strong concern, I'm in a more of a ain't broke, don't fix it camp. But I'm interested in listening for through the next phase of the process when we hear from those folks. Thank you, Ben, for all the good work on it.
Sure, thanks.
Okay, Grant, then Sarah.
Are you able to hear me okay?
Sir, say that again.
Grant, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think kind of the two different concepts that we're mixing up a little bit. One is sort of fixed versus variable and how that relates to volume. And then the other is sort of specificity or granularity or kind of temporally in terms of how often we should be calculating those things. But I think it gave me a lot of pause to hear kind of the foundation of this idea being that we're largely fixed and not variable. And, a gallon one way or the other doesn't really make a difference. I think that really just kind of goes against the way that we do allocate by volume across communities. And so I guess partly would like to better understand the scale of that. I mean, obviously at some point it makes a difference, right? Otherwise, why would we charge different communities different amounts if it really doesn't matter what the volume is? So I think getting a better handle on at what point volume does matter. And if it's true that we are so much fixed, then maybe to me, it just opens up a lot more questions about our entire, the way that we're charging. And if it is about peak flows and capacity, then why aren't we charging customer communities based on that? And then we don't care about actual flows, which then also bangs into our I&I initiatives. And why do we care about I&I then if it doesn't really matter? And it sounds like our strategies around that after the last discussions with customer communities was we're going to kind of we're not going to push hard for folks to address it. So we're going to have to tie it to incentivizing it, which I was imagining kind of going the opposite way, charging more for volume to give customer communities the incentives to deal with I&I. So I think for me, it's really bumping up into kind of broader questions about how we're covering costs. I think at least personally it'd be helpful to get a more detail around this question of fixed versus variable. And do we need to reconsider our overall schema? I think kind of pulling all those questions aside, I'm definitely open to, if there are efficiencies to calculating volumes, and I think there's a way to move to what's being described, but I think we have to be really thoughtful and careful. If the message is volumes don't really matter, I think I'm having a hard time being coherent about then how we talk
Right.
about things like conservation, et cetera.
That is, I think Commissioner Foster, you framed some really good issues that I think we have to answer in the rate structure question, the long term. I think there have been a lot of assumptions that our current model influences behavior in the short term. And the issue of volume is it is very important at the peak level when it gets above a certain point. That's why I&I is important. And when that peak goes above what our systems are designed for. And there are many ways to handle that besides the charging. Our sewer use ordinance could set standards for peak flow and require communities to reduce that. But I think that's part of the big study to see, is this model really working for us? I think we have the same questions.
I think the last thing I would just add is it would be interesting to hear from the communities, because I mean, I think at least for those communities that, you know, turn around and charge out based on flows to end users, even if we give more stability from a budgeting perspective, here are the charges, they're still going to have variability in terms of what they're collecting from individuals based on actual utilization, which maybe that's less variable because they're not taking into account I&I and things like that. So maybe that's less of an issue, but I think they're still going to be dealing with variability, even if we gave them very predictable numbers from our end.
Okay, thanks, Grant. I didn't see Sarah's hand up anymore, but I wanted to make a couple comments. Ezra, I agree with your observation. Oh, there's Sarah. I agree with your observation on my earlier comment. I was making the comment because there was concern about a Sanimax, for example, all of a sudden increasing their loads, and instead of ameliorating it or massaging it out over 2 or 3 or whatever years, they still get billed for it. It's just a year later. That was the way I was thinking of that. I think we have to remember that what Ben has been talking about here is kind of an interim process for 1 or 2 years, depending on if we do that larger whole rate study. That I think those are the questions that Michael was getting at with Grant's, very well put observation about what does this really all mean in terms of larger. And I go back to the presentation, I think it was the last meeting that Ben did with the graphs and everything, and that overall the district actually as a whole does quite well in terms of its rate projections. There's, every now and then there's 1 or 2 years there, we're off by more than other years, but we've normally come in within a couple percent. I think the problem comes in with the differences in local communities, how all of a sudden, I look at it's kind of like a balloon. We have our fixed cost, which is the balloon, and all of a sudden something happens to a Sanimax, or years past was Oscar Mayer. You push the balloon, their loading might drop, but somebody else's loadings go, they end up paying more. And I think that's kind of the whole deal of why they're looking at this. It's not because the district as a whole, it's because of the variation that you can see annually within communities. And so I think that's why they're kind of looking at this more, looking back a year or a couple of years or something like that. So, if we're the district as a whole, I think, you can always expect some type of variation. But I think overall we've been doing well. Is that those local communities, and some it hits more than others, right? And Madison has a much bigger base to go to than a Westport or a Morrisonville or wherever. So I'm sorry about that taking so much time. Sarah, you want to go ahead?
Well, I was just going to say, similar to where you started, Tom, I appreciate this process being outlined, because I think we're diving into one of the proposed interim solutions that Ben highlighted. And so I just wanted to comment that I think it has been incredibly helpful for you to both outline a process for input, but also bring a proposed solution to the table, because I think you can see, just even in the commission conversation today, how much more fruitful the response is when we come with a proposed solution to our customer communities. So I very much look forward to Q1 conversations, hearing what you get back from that, especially by engaging them in a broader conversation while also having some solutions, because I think sometimes we get a little stuck in the broad conversations and don't kind of drill our customer communities down onto the finer points of, okay, if this is the problem, here's a proposed solution. Let's then respond to that, because I think it highlights exactly, to Grant's point, some of the broader questions that we should be asking when we are actually addressing something specific. So my comment was much more an appreciation on the process and an observation about how fruitful it's been even this morning. So thanks for that.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Bill, you had an observation or comment? Bill Walker?
I do. I wanted to highlight something here for the record and for people to think about. We have, Michael is laughing at me right now. We have, and now I've lost my train of thought. We have identified the key job of service charges is to fairly allocate our largely fixed costs. And the underlying issue that the commission is grappling with is, what does fairness mean? And one view is that the way to be fair is to adjust charges as frequently as possible on a quarterly basis. Commissioner Wilson, that's where you were coming from. Another view is, no, that doesn't actually help. It's enough to adjust on an annual basis. That's the question. And I agree with President Hubble and Commissioner Eskridge that that's ultimately a question for the longer process. But it does sort of surface in this shorter one. And that's the thing that I think we'll ultimately be looking for commission and of course, owner community guidance on. What counts as fair in terms of our allocation and the timing of that? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Grant?
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to highlight, and thanks, Bill, but to me, there still are two questions. One is what's fair in terms of how frequently we're measuring that, but then I still have another, I guess, bigger question, which is if it's and that we're designed around peak flows, then is our whole underlying structure of what is fair, i.e. based on volume, is that true? So to me, I guess there still are there's two questions. How frequently and granular do we need to measure volumes, but is volumes even, should it continue to have the primary role it has in being fair? Or if it's true that it's mostly about managing to peak, then should customer communities be paying proportionate to how much peak capacity they can add to the system and how prepared we are, how much we're paying to have that capacity, regardless of how much they actually put through there. So I guess to me, there's still those kind of two separate outstanding questions.
All right. Well, that's really what I have, but I just want to, thanks everyone for the thoughtful discussion. I think the issues that you're bringing up are issues that we're grappling with too. Oh, Bill, did you want to respond to that?
No, I also forget to lower my hand. Sorry.
So I think, the last thing I'll say is just that we wanted to be thoughtful about our process, come to you early to get initial feedback, and then really have this be a process with heavy stakeholder engagement, because really we're trying to do this to solve a perceived problem that our owner communities are experiencing. And if what we hear back from them is something different, then we will most certainly take that into consideration as we move forward here. So that's going to be really kind of a guiding North Star, I think, as we go through this process. So.
Thank you, Bill, Ben. And why I was smiling at Bill is, we've, at the staff level, we've been discussing, we cannot find any commission policy ever on how we allocate these charges. I think it was decided at the staff level a long time ago. And what we want to do is ask that question of what is fair and how do we allocate that, and check in on this short-term issue. And so that's what we're excited to work with you on.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ben. I think there's not unanimity on even the interim approach here. So I think we're probably anxious to see what our customer communities have to say, and there may not be unanimity among the customer communities either, I can't remember who made the comment about if it's not broke, don't fix it. But I think then we also ought to be giving pause and thinking really, if depending on what we do here, do we really move on to the next step if the loadings and everything else are so important to everybody? I don't want to be spending a few $100,000 on a rate study if we're going to say, hey, we're pretty happy with what we've been doing. So just something for people to keep in the back of their mind. Okay. Let's see, I gotta get back to my thing closed out here. So that will, anybody else have any observations or questions? We had a pretty decent number of questions and discussion. I just don't want to end it now. If anybody else has anything to say. I think we covered pretty much everybody. Okay, we'll move on to the Chief Engineer Direct Report, the CED update. Michael.
Thank you, President Hubble. I just want to remind the commission that our owner community meeting will be held on December 2nd. We'll be presenting the findings and recommendations of the Energy Master Plan and seek owner input. The commission shared with me that we should invite Dane County as well. We have invited Dane County to join us at that meeting, and they have confirmed their attendance. We will also be briefly touching on the infrastructure bill, which there are a lot of questions. I've fielded some questions by some of our owner communities about how that may impact district service charges. So I'll be touching on that as well. It'll be a similar report as to what I gave the commission at the last meeting with updated information. And speaking of the infrastructure bill, I am going to be having a meeting with the executive director from Milwaukee Met and Green Bay Met right after this meeting, Kevin Schaefer and Tom Sigmund. And we are discussing infrastructure bill grants to Wisconsin wastewater. And we're going to try to develop a cohesive strategy between us three utilities on how we want to interact with the DNR on the Clean Water Fund allocations for this program, what that would look like for Wisconsin. So we're continuing our local work because what comes from the federal government and the EPA and how that gets translated and distributed through Wisconsin is still unknown. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, President Hubble, to see if there's any questions.
Okay, anybody have any questions for Michael? I don't see any hands up, so we'll move on to the regulatory and legal review. Paul?
Good morning once again. Last month was another busy month for us. This is our time to kind of review past legal projects and expenses. A fair number of regulatory issues. Obviously, we're wrapping up the disinfection issue that you heard about earlier today. There have been some questions about land application, the site approval process at DNR, some issues on Badger Mill Creek, and that will be coming up in a few more meetings. Some wetland issues associated with our lagoon project. And then Dane County had a stormwater ordinance that we were looking at. So a number of regulatory issues. On kind of the HR side, we were looking, and administrative side, looking, spent some time looking at a privacy policy and social media issues with Amanda. Obviously, on the service charges, we're working with Bill and Ben to take a look at, some of the legal issues associated with that. And then on the contract end of things, I think I'd mentioned earlier, our real estate team had met with members of the district to, develop some things going forward prospectively, and we need to follow up on those. There was a question on custodial services, and then there was the issues associated with some work on the Yahara River that we needed to address. So all in all, a fairly busy month. So looking forward to things being a little quieter next month, but we'll see. Be glad to answer any questions.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Any questions for Paul? Okay, I don't see anybody. So we'll move on to Alan with the operations report.
Good morning, commissioners. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Good. Okay. Alan Grooms, operations manager, and I'll be delivering the October plant performance report. Got the normal dashboard metrics. Effluent, these are effluent parameters we're looking at here. Effluent CBOD 5, 1.8 milligrams per liter, well below our limit. November, we go to a less stringent limit. So we usually don't have any problem anywhere close to having a problem with the CBOD numbers on effluent. And so that'll we look in really good shape on that. Similarly, ammonia is right in the middle of normal operating range we would see for this period. Phosphorus, kind of right down the middle. Suspended solids has dropped. We had a pretty good month on getting stuff settled out and cleared up. Again, those numbers tend to relax a little bit as we get into winter. But right now that number looks pretty good. You may recall some of these past months, they do tend to escalate a little bit in the mid to late summer period as we start to see some denitrification in our final clarifiers. So that can push that suspended solids number up on our effluent, and also kind of takes that phosphorus with us where we do biological phosphorus removal. Our chloride numbers are right down the middle, and our final fecal coliform numbers for this year, again, right down the middle, pretty respectable 64. Our limit is 400 on that. So, and as you may recall, our current permit has us disinfection season goes to October 15th. So those units have been shut down, and we had a successful completion to our first inaugural season, I guess, with the new UV system. So any questions on the dashboard performance metrics? Okay, seeing none. Resource recovery, again, on struvite, we were trailing. We've seen a tapering off the last few years of struvite recovery, and that looks like that's going to continue through 2021. These are in terms of tons shipped. So individual month, it may depend on how many trucks come or go, but longer term average over the course of months, those tend to average out. Clean water is also reflective of that's what we're returning to the environment, our cleaned returned effluent. That I'm guessing that's projecting that's going to come out somewhere in that 13 billion gallons range. So again, that continues a downward trend as well for that. Out of curiosity, in the packet, it was showing we've been talking about our flows being down around 36 MGD, whereas we had previously, we normally speak this as a 40 MGD plant. I did some looking back for last time we had sustained low flows like this was 2012. So I didn't have to go as far back as I thought, but 2012 was very similar in terms of flows. So about 9 years back to see something comparable for a comparable year. So We do see periods like that come up, it looks like, so back on the historical record. Biogas production looks to be about where we would expect it to be. Our Metroville cake, we've been hindered by making some of that by some equipment issues that are resolved. So we're looking at in early 2022, start making more of that. Our Metro Grow liquid production is up, so that's kind of the yin and the yang of the Metro cake. So that's our biosolids going out into liquid Class B biosolids. This is what we're producing and putting in storage. We've had a really good hauling year. The tanks are virtually empty right now going into winter, and we're in really great shape going into this winter. But because we're putting so much into the liquid program, that's pushed that number up. And we've had some maintenance activities as well in the plant that have pushed that up. And then our reused effluent, it's just a function of how much we're disinfecting and reusing. You could look at this as this is an offset of potable water that we would purchase from the city. So this water is water we would use for seal water, polymer makedown, things like that, belt washing, those kind of things. If we weren't reusing the effluent, disinfecting that and putting it, reclaiming that, we would be making this kind of purchase from the water utility. And that would be water that, drinking water quality that we would be using for purposes that don't demand drinking water. So just to refresh some of the commissioners on what that represents. So any questions on the resource recovery? Okay, with that, I have nothing else. Thank you and have a good Thanksgiving.
Okay. Thank you, Alan. Have a good Thanksgiving yourselves and your family. Okay, that takes us to the future meeting schedule. That's in the packet. Future agenda topics, also with the packet, with the meeting schedule. And then any other business? If not, do we have a motion to adjourn?
Yes, you have a motion to adjourn by Commissioner Wilson.
Okay, Commissioner Wilson makes the motion to adjourn. Do we have a second?
Second, Commissioner Clark.
Second by Commissioner Clark. So motion by Commissioner Wilson, second by Commissioner Clark to adjourn. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Happy
Opposed?
Thanksgiving,
Everybody have a good
everyone.
Thanksgiving. Thank you for
Happy
joining us.
Thanksgiving.
Stay safe.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Bye all.
Bye-bye.